he was called a traitor
by the very people who once believed he spoke for them. At the height of his influence, when his voice echoed across an entire generation, he made a choice that turned admiration into anger. So what really happened to Bob Dylan? And why did everything begin to fall apart when he had already won? The lights never changed. The crowds were still there, and his name still carried weight wherever he went. But underneath it all, something had already begun to shift, quietly, almost invisibly, from the outside. It looked like a perfect rise. A young artist, discovered at the right moment. Songs that didn't just entertain, but seemed to understand people. And for a while, that was enough. But Dylan was never built to stay still. Even in those early years, there were signs, a restlessness, a distance from expectations, a quiet refusal to become something predictable, because what the world saw was a voice, but what they didn't see was a man already moving beyond the role they had given him, and that's where the tension began. Not with failure, but with success. That came with demands to repeat, to stay familiar, to remain the version people had already accepted. But what followed was something very different. A decision that would confuse audiences, divide critics, and change the sound of modern music. And the truth behind that decision is far more complicated than most people realize. To understand it, we have to go back to the beginning, before the crowds, before the headlines, before anyone tried to explain who he was. There was just a young man with a guitar and something people couldn't quite describe. The first time many heard him, it wasn't clear. The words were hard to follow. The voice didn't fit the standards people were used to hearing, and yet something stayed. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt different. There was a presence, a quiet intensity that made people stop. Just a little longer than they expected, some would later say. Even back then, you had the feeling you were standing near someone important. Inside Columbia Records, that feeling didn't matter. What mattered there was performance, sales, predictability, and his first album barely sold. 6, maybe 7,000 copies. At a time when success meant tens of thousands. To the executives, this wasn't potential, it was failure. Because Dylan didn't look like a star. He didn't sound like one. He didn't write the kind of songs that were easy to market. No simple love stories, no polished image, no band behind him. Just a guitar, a harmonica, and lyrics that didn't follow any familiar pattern. And for a moment, it almost ended there. There were real discussions about removing him completely. Meetings where numbers spoke louder than instinct. Careers have ended in rooms like that, quietly, without anyone noticing. But this time, something unexpected happened. A young producer, only 22 years old, stood up in a room full of doubt and said no, not because the data supported it, not because the album performed well, but because he saw something else. A songwriter with a voice that didn't belong to the present moment. someone who could write songs. Other artists would need someone whose value wasn't immediate, but inevitable. And that decision, the one that kept Bob Dylan from being dropped, changed everything. Because without it, the story would have ended before it even began. But keeping him came with a cost, because the very thing that made him worth saving was also the thing that would make him impossible to control. And sooner or later, that difference would collide with everything around him. At first, it looked like everything was falling into place. The songs were spreading, the audience was growing, and somewhere along the way, Bob Dylan became more than just an artist. He became a voice, not just any voice, but one people trusted, followed, believed in. His music wasn't just heard. It was felt. It spoke to something deeper, something people couldn't always explain, but knew was real. And for a moment, it seemed like he had found exactly where he belonged. But that was only from the outside, because inside, something else was already happening. The more people tried to define him, the more he resisted. They called him a protest singer, a symbol, a voice of a movement. But Dylan never fully accepted that. Not openly, not completely, because to him, the songs were never instructions. They weren't answers. They were observations, moments, fragments of truth, captured in time. And that difference was small at first. But it didn't stay small. It grew quietly, slowly, until it began to change. Everything around him, from the outside, the image still worked. The recognition kept building. The influence kept expanding. But underneath, there was pressure. Not the kind you could see, not the kind people talked about, but the kind that comes when the world expects you to stay the same, to repeat what worked, to protect what people already love, to become predictable without ever being told directly. And Dylan felt that not as a demand spoken out loud, but as something always there, something waiting. And instead of moving toward it, he moved away. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deliberately. He began to change direction, not just in what he wrote, but in how it sounded. There was a shift in energy, a different kind of intensity, something less controlled, more raw. And slowly, the idea started to take shape. Electric, not just as a sound, but as a statement. A different presence on stage, a different relationship with the audience. For Dylan, it wasn't rebellion. It wasn't about breaking rules. It was about not being trapped by them. But for the audience, it meant something else. Because by then, they weren't just listening to him. They were holding on to what he represented. And when someone represents something larger than themselves, change becomes dangerous because it feels personal. And that's exactly what this became. Not just a musical shift, but an emotional one. A break between expectation and reality, between what people wanted and what he was becoming. The transition didn't happen overnight, but once it started, it didn't slow down. He surrounded himself with musicians who understood movement, not perfection, not precision, but movement. A band that could follow, something unpredictable, something alive. And together, they began shaping a sound that didn't belong to what came before, something louder, heavier, less contained. And with every step forward, the distance grew between him and the people who thought they knew him. From the outside, everything still looked like success. The crowds were bigger, the attention was stronger, but inside those rooms, something had changed. The audience didn't know what was coming, not fully. They expected a continuation, a familiar feeling, something they could recognize from the first note. But what they were about to hear would feel completely different. And once that moment arrived, there would be no way to undo it, no way to go back. To what he had been, only forward, into something louder, more uncertain, and far more divisive than anyone expected. And when he finally stepped onto that stage, with that new sound, everything began to change. When the tour began, no one expected what was about to happen. The first half of the show felt familiar. Just him, a guitar, the sound people had come to hear, and for a moment, everything felt safe, recognizable, comfortable, exactly what they expected. But then, he walked off stage, and when he came back, everything changed. The guitar was different, the sound was louder, and he wasn't alone anymore. There was a band behind him, energy building, before a single note was fully understood. And almost immediately, you could feel it. Something in the room shifted. Confusion first, then tension. Because this wasn't what they paid for. They came for something specific, something they believed. They already knew. But what they were hearing now felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and for some, unacceptable. The reaction didn't start loud. It started small, a few voices, a few scattered boos. But night after night, it grew, louder, sharper, more personal. Some said he had sold out. Others said he had betrayed them. They believed he had abandoned something important, something they trusted him to protect. But the reality was something very different. This wasn't about money. In fact, it cost him more to do it this way. The equipment, the band, the scale of the sound, everything made the tour more difficult, not less. But Dylan wasn't chasing approval. He wasn't trying to satisfy expectations. He was following something else, something internal, something he couldn't ignore, even if it meant losing everything he had just built. And on stage, you could see it. The moment the acoustic set ended, something changed in him. He became restless, focused, almost like something inside was waiting to break free. And when it did, it came out loud, unfiltered, unapologetic. The band followed him, learning in real time, building the sound. As they played, mistakes weren't hidden. They became part of the energy, because this wasn't about perfection. It was about movement. And with every show, the divide grew wider between what the audience expected and what he was becoming, until one night, everything reached a breaking point. Manchester, a hall filled with anticipation and tension that had been building for weeks. You could feel it before the music even started. The first half played out as expected. Acoustic, controlled, familiar. But everyone in that room knew what was coming next. And when it arrived, it didn't take long. The sound shifted, the volume rose, and the distance between him and the audience became undeniable. Then it happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through everything. Judas. One word. Sharp. Direct. Unforgiving. And for a moment, everything stood still. Not the music, not the noise, but the meaning. Because that word wasn't just criticism, it was accusation to them. He hadn't just changed his sound. He had betrayed something they believed belonged to all of them. All eyes turned to him, waiting to see what he would do. And he didn't walk away. He didn't apologize. He stepped forward and responded, not with explanation, but with defiance, a refusal to accept their version of him. Then he turned to the band, and everything exploded. The next song hit harder than anything before it, louder, heavier, more deliberate, not to win them back, but to push through them. The sound filled the room, overpowering the resistance, and in that moment, the divide was complete. There was no going back, no returning to what he had been, only forward into something they didn't yet understand. Years later, people would look back at that night as a turning point, not just for him. But for music itself, because what was rejected then would eventually become the new standard. But in that moment, standing on that stage, he was alone, surrounded by thousands of people, and completely on his own side. And that kind of moment doesn't end. When the show is over, it follows you into silence, into exhaustion, into something far more difficult to face. After the tour, the noise didn't disappear. It stayed, not just in the headlines, not just in the reviews, but inside him, night after night. The tension, the resistance, the constant pushback. It didn't end. When the stage went dark, it followed him into quiet rooms, into long flights, into moments where everything should have felt still, but wasn't, because this was no longer just music. It had become something else, a constant confrontation between who he was and who the world needed him to be. And that kind of weight, it builds slowly, silently, until something gives. Then came the accident. A motorcycle, a sudden moment, a fall. No one fully understood. Some said he broke his neck. Others believed it was far less serious. The details were unclear, but the effect was undeniable. Everything stopped. Tours were canceled. Plans disappeared. Momentum cut off completely. And just like that, he was gone from the center of everything. No stage, no spotlight, no constant demand to explain himself, just distance. And maybe, for the first time in years, space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to exist without being watched. Some believed he had burned out, that the pressure had finally caught up to him. Others thought he had stepped away on purpose, that the accident was simply the moment that made it possible. Because success doesn't slow things down, it accelerates everything. And if you don't step away, it doesn't stop. So whether it was the cause or just the turning point, this was a pause he could no longer avoid. But it wasn't the end. It was a reset. And when he returned, it wasn't to the same version of himself. It was something different, more complex, less predictable, and far more difficult to define. The stage came back. The audience returned, but the energy had changed. There was scale now, large venues, massive tours, a different kind of presence, more controlled on the outside, but still unpredictable underneath. And then, something shifted again. Not in the sound this time, but in the focus, because the story was no longer just about music. It began to move into something deeper, something real. That's when he met Reuben Carter, a man in prison, convicted, surrounded by a story filled with questions. Most people who came to see him asked the same thing: are you guilty or innocent? But Dylan didn't ask that. He asked something else. Who are you? And that changed everything. Because instead of judging, he listened. And what he heard stayed with him, not as a headline, not as a cause, but as a story, one that needed to be told. And from that came a song, Hurricane. Not short, not simple, but detailed, layered, powerful. A story compressed into minutes that carried years of pain and complexity. And suddenly, music became something else again. Not just expression, not just identity, but action. The concerts changed. They became more than performances. They became statements. Events built around purpose, fundraisers, awareness. A way to pull a single story into the center of national attention. Madison Square Garden. Crowds. Energy. Not just there to listen, but to witness something bigger. And beyond the music, there was impact. Legal attention. Media attention. Pressure building. From outside the courtroom. And for a moment, it felt like something was shifting, not just for one man, but for what music could actually do. But even then, it wasn't simple, because the more visible he became, the more complicated everything around him became. The tours grew larger, the performances more theatrical. Rolling thunder, a moving stage, a traveling world. Costumes, faces painted, music blended with performance, reality blurred with storytelling. It wasn't just a concert anymore. It was something closer to a moving film, a shifting narrative. That changed from night to night, and inside it, he moved freely, no longer fixed, to one identity, no longer predictable. But even in that freedom, there were cracks, tension within the group, chaos behind the scenes, moments that didn't feel as controlled as they appeared, because the larger it became, the harder it was to hold together. And still, the audience watched, trying to understand, trying to follow, but never quite catching up. Because Dylan was never standing still, not long enough for anyone to define him completely. And that became his pattern. Move forward. Change direction. Leave behind what people just began to understand. From the outside, it looked like evolution. From the inside, it felt like constant motion. And to the world, he became something larger than music. Not just an artist, but a symbol that refused to stay in one shape in America. He represented freedom, but also contradiction, a voice people needed, and at the same time, couldn't fully hold on to around the world. He became something else. Proof that music didn't need to follow rules, that identity could shift, that expression could change without permission. But with that came distance, because the more he changed, the harder it became for people to feel like they knew him. And maybe that was always the point, not to be understood, but to remain in motion, because staying still was never who he was. And after everything, the noise, the pressure, the reinvention, one question remained. Not about the music, not about the fame, but about the cost. Because the further he moved forward, the further he moved away from everything that once made him belong. In the end, it wasn't the noise that defined him, not the boos, not the headlines, not even the moments when the world turned against him, because those things, they passed. What remained was something quieter, a man who never stood still, a man who refused to become what others needed him to be. At the beginning, that freedom looked like promise, the chance to say something real, to create something that mattered. In the middle, that same freedom looked like power, the ability to change direction, to reshape sound, to move ahead of everything around him. But in the end, that freedom came with a cost. Distance, misunderstanding, moments of standing alone, even in a room full of people. And maybe that's what that moment in Manchester really was. Not just a crowd turning on him, but a line between what people wanted and what he was willing to become. He never crossed back. And because of that, music changed, not all at once, not in a single moment, but over time, because someone refused to stay the same. In the end, it was never about being accepted, not about it being understood. It was about continuing forward, even when the world wanted him to stand still. And that is why his story never really ended. It just kept moving. If this story reminds you of someone, write their name below.